Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. And if you've been listening to Point of View for any length of time, you know that oftentimes on our Friday weekend edition, Kelly Shackelford is in studio with us with First Liberty, and we talk about religious liberty issues. And if he's not here, then certainly one of his other colleagues joins us, or else we get somebody from the American Center for Law and Justice, or someone, because we have certainly felt that this issue of religious liberty is a very important issue, and so we feature it every single time that we possibly can on our weekend edition. Today we're going to look at it in a little bit different way. That is, there is a new book out called It's Dangerous to Believe: Religious Freedom and Its Enemies, and it focuses on not only these very important cases that we highlight from time to time, but also why this is taking place and why you have, in some cases, almost a secular witch hunt. And what is that all about, and how can we maybe reverse some of those very concerning trends? So we're going to be talking today with the author of that book, Mary Eberstadt, and she is the research fellow at the Hoover Institute, as well as a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Perhaps you have seen some of her other books. She has written, of course, for First Things, and for some time was the executive editor of the National Interest magazine. Also served in the State Department and was a special assistant to one of my former professors, Jean Kirkpatrick. At that time, she was professor. Then, of course, she was UN ambassador. And she has written quite a bit in so many different articles. We have given you a link to her website. And as well, we also have information about this book in case you want to understand a little bit more about the threats to religious liberty. Mary Eberstadt, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
One of the things we spend so much time talking about are these individual cases. Sometimes these cases go to the Supreme Court. Sometimes they go to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Sometimes they're demand letters. You kind of look at those as well and then get behind it. But for just a minute, I have certainly felt that in your introduction, you are addressing the same concern we are, and that is this seems to be increasing. I know years ago when I sat down with Kelly Shackelford and said, it might be nice to have a segment once a week when you're on to talk about religious liberty. At the time, and this was years ago, I said, I wonder if we can fill that up. Now, I honestly believe that we could fill the entire 2 hours every Friday just talking about all these religious liberty cases. Is that your perception?
That is absolutely right, Kerby, and there are more of them by the week. I first became aware of this several years ago when I started following some of the cases in England and seeing that it was becoming possible to go to jail there for speaking words from the book of Leviticus aloud on the street, for example. The religious liberty cases there turned out to be just the cutting edge of what is proliferating now across the United States. In just a few short years, it has emerged that the United States has a religious liberty problem all its own. And there are, as you say, these individual cases. All of them are important, and they tend to be the stuff of headline news. But there are also deeper structural things going on that are really inimical to religious freedom in this country. And those are the things that I was trying to bring out in the book, as well as the individual anecdotes of people being penalized for their religious faith.
One of the things I found is we've had Paul Diamond on this program, a barrister there in England, and a number of years ago, he actually was on with us first by phone, and now he's been in studio a couple of times saying essentially the same thing. What we have been going through in the UK, you're going to now be going through as well. And he's wanted to sort of warn Americans that, again, you have this situation, if we can stay at UK for just a minute, and what's over there, just even addressing some of these issues, speaking out against Islam, speaking out against homosexuality, even doing it in a gracious way can get you in a lot of trouble, and oftentimes you'll end up in court, won't you?
Yes, increasingly so. And Paul Diamond and his office do amazing work defending the victims of this kind of thing. The delivery van driver who was fired for leaving a cross on the dashboard, for example, or the very famous case of the British Airways attendant who was told she couldn't wear a cross around her neck, even though other kinds of religious expression are permitted. So what the British cases go to show is what we are seeing in the United States more and more, which is there is a double standard about these things. It is okay to single out traditional Christians in particular for social opprobrium and for penalties in a way that would be unthinkable if it were being directed against other religious groups. So the double standard is part of the problem. And of course, the biggest part of the problem is that unlike the UK, we have a First Amendment that most Americans probably think safeguards religious liberty. And that's why Americans need to know, whether they are religious believers themselves or not, they need to understand that during the past 10 years, there has been not just a change, but I think a real civilizational change in the way that Christianity is treated in the public square.
Sometimes we say on this program, and I would imagine you might agree, that politics is downstream from culture. And so, as you said, there's a cultural change. Oftentimes, if we're dealing with these issues in the courts, it's because there has been, if you will, a permission in the culture to refer to a person as a Christian bigot, permission in the culture to ridicule and make fun of people that are churchgoers. And since I spent a fair amount of time speaking on college campuses before I ever did this radio show, how letting somebody know that you're a Christian or that you're a churchgoer is not a good way to gain tenure in the academy. True?
That is certainly true, and there are a number of cases in the book where I cite other authorities about what actually goes on in admissions committees looking at candidates for college, say, on secular campuses. The level of anti-Christian bias there is remarkable, and it's one more indication that what's going on out there is a multifaceted, deep, structural change in the way that many secular people view Christianity. Once upon a time, there were tolerant liberals in this country and elsewhere who really believed that we need to live and let live. We need to live with each other despite our differences, including differences over deep things. But it's not that those people are altogether gone, but the dominant voice of secularism today is a much more belligerent voice that sees traditional Christianity not as something to be tolerated, but as something to be confronted and defeated. And in the book, again, there are many cases cited of exactly this in schools, in the workplace, in the public square generally, in social situations, etc.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation today. The book is entitled It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. One of the chapters is on the roots of the new intolerance. If we did believe that tolerance would mean that even if I would disagree with you, I'd give you the right to speak that view. What about this idea of speech codes and marginalizing any kind of belief or thought that is not politically correct? And so we'll look at that. The anatomy of a secularist witch hunt, and then get into questions about diversity. And most importantly, before we're done, what can be done to change that? The book is about 150 pages, published by HarperCollins. We have information about it. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've given you an opportunity to order it online. And we'll come back and continue our conversation with Mary Eberstadt. And a little bit later, if you'd like to join us, we'll open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. Religious Liberty on the docket. We'll talk about it more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Is crime on the rise in America? You got two different answers to that question at the two political conventions. Donald Trump said violent crime has increased in cities across America. President Obama talked about huge drops in the murder rates in a number of cities. You also get various answers depending on the commentator. Newt Gingrich wrote about the crime rate statistics because comedy show host John Oliver mocked Gingrich for defending Trump's statement that crime is on the rise. I even had a caller to my radio program ask about the crime statistics since we are getting different perspectives. President Obama wanted to talk about successes in his speech, so he chose some of the long-term crime statistics. As I explained on my radio program, the crime rate has been dropping for many years, but it now seems to be increasing in major cities. Donald Trump and Newt Gingrich were talking about recent statistics. They are also correct that the crime rate is currently on the rise. Now, skeptics do point out that only a few years of data do not constitute a long-term trend. That is true, but the trend so far should concern everyone. The latest data from the FBI shows that homicides nationwide have risen 6.2% and rapes have increased 9.6%. One analysis of 56 major U.S. cities found that murders increased 16 to 17% during the period analyzed by the study. Of course, we also have lots of anecdotal information. For example, the number of murders in Chicago has risen substantially. In fact, if the trend continues, the city will have more than 600 murders this year. And there is the report from one police association that also has documented the rise in violent crime in 51 large cities surveyed. Yes, Mr. President, the crime rate has dropped over the years. But Donald Trump was talking about the recent uptick that should concern both Democrats and Republicans. John Oliver might think it's funny to mock Newt Gingrich, but the crime rate is serious stuff. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Betrayal, slavery, revenge, redemption. Ben-Hur in theaters August 19th from Paramount Pictures, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, in our program Point of View, sometimes we've talked about how it's sometimes even a question for Christians if they could go into certain careers. I mean, say you want to go into photography, but then you hear about a Christian photographer in New Mexico who was fined for declining to photograph a lesbian wedding. Or maybe you'd like to be a baker, and then we hear about the Christian baker in Oregon facing both civil and criminal penalties because she did not want to bake a cake for a gay wedding there. Or a florist. Again, we have the example there in Washington where the Attorney General in the state of Washington is suing the florist. Or maybe you want to be in the hospitality arena. Well, you got the Wildflower Inn in Vermont fined. Or maybe you want to go into counseling, and you can see the same kind of thing because you might have reservations about something. We're talking today with Mary Eberstadt about her book, It's Dangerous to Believe. And Mary, you talk a little bit about this rise of intolerance, the roots of the new intolerance. There used to be a belief, even on college campuses, that, well, I might disagree with you, but this is a place where we can have a free exchange of ideas. Now, certain ideas, especially if they come from a Christian point of view, oftentimes are excluded, and they are not something that are going to advance your career in the academic world, is it?
Absolutely, Kerby. And the longer this goes on, the clearer it becomes, I think, that what's happened is that secularism itself has given rise to a rival quasi-religious faith. It is a faith that is grounded in beliefs about the sexual revolution and the primacy of sexual expression and sexual liberty. And certain things follow from this developing faith. One of them is that the traditional Judeo-Christian moral code is an enemy. the last remaining source of dissent from the secularist faith. And so, again, I think what's happening out there is much bigger than individual cases. It is a civilizational change. And the point is, if we are going to have a change of that magnitude, then it shouldn't be allowed by stealth. We should be having an open conversation about it.
Well, and I would think that that kind of conversation can take place in a couple of arenas. One, it might be taking place, I suspect, this fall in the various political campaigns, not just for president, but I mean, religious liberty has become a much more significant political issue. So certainly that discussion and debate can take place there. It also needs to take place, wouldn't you agree, in the media, in the academy? How do we have that kind of conversation? Because, as you said, a lot of it's taking place by stealth right now.
Yes, it is, and as soon as things get into the courts, they're often out of mind. But we need to be open about this for a number of reasons, and one is the example I use in the book is that we follow the lead of Martin Luther King Jr. And what I mean by that is we need to have a civil conversation outside the court and apart from lawyers about changing hearts and minds out there. Martin Luther King's genius was in holding the opposing side to its own stated standards. I'm trying to follow his lead in this book and to say, look, secularists and progressives talk all the time about valuing diversity. Then why are they trying to impose uniformity on education, for example? Very important subject, that, by diminishing homeschooling and by attacking Christian universities and otherwise trying to shrink the options for people who want to pass on their religious faith. So that's an example of a case where I think we can have a civil conversation and respectfully ask people on the other side whether, looking inward, they are really holding their own principles consistent. Some of them won't listen to an argument like that, but I have faith that there are people out there who will and who might actually care what's happening to their Christian neighbors and brothers and sisters and cousins and workplace companions, etc.
Well, certainly. And you do quote from, of course, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to the Birmingham jail where, again, we can never be considered an outsider. So, I mean, there's a sense in which we really need to draw more people into the conversation. And it isn't just individuals that already recognize that there is a threat to religious liberty. It should also be to others, as you point out, who are championing the idea of diversity, but on the one hand talking about diversity, but it's so narrowly defined. Isn't that part of the problem? Diversity means you actually are welcoming, the LGBT, but by saying that, you're also excluding anybody who does not hold to your particular viewpoint about gay activism, same-sex marriage, or things of that nature. Is that part of the problem?
Oh, of course it's part of the problem. Diversity is being used very cynically as a rhetorical ploy these days. Going back to the issue of education, if we truly value diversity, then we value universities of all kinds that speak to all kinds of constituencies and interests. So why is it that in the past 10 years, two flagship evangelical universities, Gordon College in Massachusetts and King's College in New York, have had to undergo accreditation battles? Think about that. These were ideologically driven secular attacks on two important Christian schools. And even though the schools ended up keeping their accreditation, it's clear that this kind of battle is just the beginning. There is a piece that I mention in the book that was written by a professor at the University of Pennsylvania arguing that there should be no accreditation for religious schools, period.
Yes.
This will be the next frontier of this ideological battle. And again, if things are going to be that extreme, we'd better be talking about it instead of pretending that it isn't happening or wishing that it wasn't happening. It is.
And that is part of the problem, too. I remember when some of these books have come out, I can think of, for example, when the book Persecution came out by David Limbaugh, there were a lot of people that, even when that book came out, that was years ago, saying, oh, these are just isolated cases. And that's why he put together a book that I think it was about 200 or 300 pages worth of examples. And of course, now these are coming out all the time because there are just a lot of people that need to understand that this is not just an isolated case here or there. If you listen to our program every Friday, you realize that this is just going on everywhere. And that's why I think we need to start the conversation as you talk about. But let me get into one other topic, because we've talked about what's kind of happening in the public arena. And certainly we've talked about what's happening in education. And of course, we get in the military because we've done that as well. But one that you also talk about is what's happening in the business world. And the best example I guess I can use is Brendan Eich, who was the CEO of Mozilla. Now, his crime, in quotes, was the fact that he had actually given money supporting Proposition 8 in the actual election of 2008 in California. And that was enough for the people in that particular company to hound him out of office, hound him out of his position, simply because he supported a particular initiative that was supported by a majority of people in the state of California.
Yes, the case of Ike is important for a couple of reasons, I think, Kerby. One is, just think about that. If someone as powerful as a CEO of a major firm can be intimidated and campaigned against and made to lose his position for holding traditional beliefs, then where does that leave the rest of us who don't have that kind of power?
Well said.
So it's one reason why his case needs to be front and center in these kinds of discussions. The other thing is that what happened after his firing was something very interesting. There was an open letter that was written and signed by a couple score people, including some leaders of the movement for same-sex marriage. These were mostly liberal-minded people, progressive activists, who said, whoa, what just happened to Ike is something that shouldn't be happening in a democracy, let alone one with our Constitution. And so this was a very interesting expression of contrarian sentiment coming from the other side of the political spectrum over the idea that incivility had gone too far. I hold up that example in my book because I think what we need, even more than court cases, are many more examples like that of fair-minded people who may not agree with what their Christian neighbors think, but who do defend their right to think it and say it. And I think if we approach the problem that way, we might be able to make some small c converts for the greater cause of civility and religious liberty.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, if you'd like to join us, a privilege to have with us today Mary Eberstadt as we talk about his book, It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. And as we go to a break, let me just remind you that we are supported by listeners, and we have found that during the month of August, that's a time when giving usually tends to drop rather significantly. So if you've appreciated the conversations we've had in the past about religious liberty, and even this one today, I really encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net, and click on that donate button. We certainly do need to hear from you in the month of August, and if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate it. We'll take a break and take some phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
A prince, falsely accused of treason, separated from his family and the woman he loves, forced into slavery. He returns home seeking revenge, but instead finds redemption. It's Brother Against Brother in Ben-Hur with Academy Award winner Morgan Freeman.
If your brother is the pride of Rome, defeat him and you'll defeat an empire. Then you will have your vengeance.
Ben-Hur, in theaters August 19th from Paramount Pictures, rated PG-13. $5 doesn't buy much anymore, but $5 can change hearts and a nation. The 2016 presidential election has been very divisive, so what is a Christian to do? Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View Radio will be here each day on the road to November, and your $5 investment will make a difference. You want to do more? Fine, do it, but please stop what you're doing and at least give us $5. Visit pointofview.net, look for the Donate Now button, or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or send your gift to Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening. Not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Mary Eberstadt as we talk about her book, It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. HarperCollins, we have information about her and about the book on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Missouri first. Scott, thank you for calling today.
Kerby, thanks for taking the call. I think my main question is, if you look at history, it's always been persecution that drove the church to new heights or to new places. As an example, out of the Middle East into Europe, via Italy up into Great Britain, and then obviously into the United States. So are we witnessing that drive to go somewhere else? You know, the question is sort of, are we witnessing that drive to go somewhere else, or are we witnessing the end of the age and the rapture of the church? That's sort of the question I have in what's happening in the U.S., and I can hang up and listen to an answer.
Sure. Mary, one of the things I thought was so striking in your book is you've interviewed people, as I have as well, that have said, you know, I'm really suspecting more persecution coming. When I have Dr. Erwin Lutzer on or Franklin Graham or something, that lots of times they'll say that kind of thing. And you found that to be the case among a number of Christian leaders, haven't you?
Yes, I don't think the mood among Christian leaders has ever been as dark in the United States, and I'm not saying that to be alarmist. I think most of the leaders, including those you mentioned, would agree with that assessment. Now, we have to be careful and distinguish, of course, the persecution, what Pope Francis called the soft persecution of believers in the Western countries, with what's going on in the Middle East, where there is genocide of Christians, as the United States government belatedly recognized last year. So there is persecution of different dimensions on different fronts, but I take the caller's point. Out of these kinds of phases, great things could come. I happened to be in France right after the Catholic priest was murdered the other week, and the most extraordinary thing happened. The churches were suddenly full. And if you've been in Europe lately, you know that that's a rare occurrence. But
Yes.
The big churches were full because adversity had reached such a state that people could unite around it and realize that they couldn't be as cavalier about their Christian heritage as they had been previously. So, yes, there's persecution of different kinds, and yes, the future that's being written by it is something that we can't see yet.
Well, I certainly would agree with that. Let's, if we can, get back to this idea of this secularist witch hunt, because in some respects, that can be overdone, obviously, and I know you don't, but there are certainly this a desire to sort of root out individuals, because the kind of the classical liberal formulation was that it really was a live and let live. I may disagree passionately even with your perspective, but I want to grant you the right to be able to express that. And even if you are the head of a company, you're a professor at a university, you're a photographer, florist, baker, whatever, okay, I don't agree with that decision you've made, but if I disagree, I'll go to another university, I'll go to another baker, or I'll go to another florist. Now it is the deliberate targeting of the few people that won't bow the knee. And so what about that? Because you refer to that as kind of a secularist witch hunt.
Well, I do think witch hunt is a fair metaphor here, because there is a level of irrationalism and vindictiveness that secularists aim against Christians these days, and it really demands to be called out. If you look at the social issues, Kerby, you know, and I know, and your listeners know, that over the last several decades, one issue after another has been lost from the point of view of traditional-minded believers. Obscenity, abortion, same-sex marriage, etc. So the point of rehearsing that litany is to say, why then are Christians being pursued so ferociously in the public square? It's not as if tradition-minded Christians have all the power in this country. It's not as if they've been on a victory tour, winning one great battle after another. It is actually quite the opposite. So what is it that accounts for the determination of their opponents? And I think the determination of those opponents has a big irrational kind of part to it. that hasn't been adequately discussed in public. And it's sort of like a witch hunting fever, or sort of like the daycare hysteria of the 1980s. You know, one of these eruptions of just collective moral panic is not rational. And so that's something else that I think we can get at.
Sure. It's almost like a mop-up operation, kind of like, okay, we won the battle, but we still have a few stragglers there, so we need to finish them off or force them to bow the knee, or whatever illustration you want to use, because like you said, the direction of the culture has been towards a more secularist mindset, a more secular worldview, the secularization and privatization and pluralization of our culture, and the West has happened for quite some time. But it is kind of interesting. Why are you picking on these few stragglers that might not necessarily be people you would agree with, if indeed your ideals are diversity, inclusion, open-mindedness? And that's why I think some people are just completely caught off guard, Mary, about how to even address some of those issues in a way that's going to be successful.
Well, one thing that today makes clear is that the new atheism of 10 years ago did a lot of damage, including to the religious believers in this country. If you remember, it was just 10 years ago, Kerby, when all those books were riding high on the bestseller list.
Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, everybody.
And they set a new low bar for rhetoric, for what you could say about Christians in this country. I saw a bumper sticker in Virginia recently that said, fundamentalists, ugly in any color. And, you know, I thought, of what other group could you possibly be that derogatory in public without people objecting? Once again, we see that things can be said of Christians that are not said of other people. And the new atheists, with their constant hammering on the supposed problems with Christianity, I think are partly responsible for the rhetorical situation that we're in now, and by extension, some of the assaults on religious liberty that we see today.
Let's talk about some of the rhetoric for just a minute, because you also address that in your book, and you also quote from Kirsten Powers, the book The Silencing, and this idea of a Christian bigot. There are certain terms that we do not allow you to use towards African Americans, women. Unfortunately, sometimes we do seem in this culture allow them towards Jewish people. But this is, I think, another kind of discussion. You said that we should certainly require individuals hold to the same standards. They say they believe in diversity, so allow diversity. They would certainly not allow name calling of other individuals. So should we then call them to no longer use terms like Christian bigots? Is that a fair kind of tactic to use in this particular battle?
Oh, I think that's something that could be asked of any civilized person, is not to use epithets like that without evidence. Today, those kinds of terms are hurled around promiscuously, as we know, whether it's Christian bigot or homophobe or transphobe, and no evidence is produced to verify that these are phrases we should be using in most cases. It's not that there aren't Christian bigots. I'm sure there are somewhere, but they aren't bigots because they're Christians. If they're good Christians, they're not bigots. So I think a little more clarity about language would help in this, too, and understanding that we don't allow this kind of name-calling elsewhere, as you point out, Kerby.
One of the things that, just before we take a break, I wanted to mention, because we're just right up against a break here, is that we have a link to your website, hoover.org, and then there are some resource materials there. Also, the book, I would encourage people to look for it in your local bookstore, but if not, there are certainly ways that they can order it. We have it so they can get it in hardback or Kindle and read it as well. And I'm just encouraging people to take some action on this today. And so one of those ideas is to take some of the material that we're making available today, the information about Mary Eberstadt or even about the book, and then maybe post it on your Facebook page, or maybe if you have a blog, or send it by email to others, or if nothing else, we do make available shortly after the broadcast a podcast, which is available. Of course, we also have it online, so there's a YouTube channel. Send it to someone else so you can get the conversation going about this issue of religious liberty. And of course, we talk about the individual cases on Friday, but today here I wanted to look at the broader picture of what is happening in our culture. And so if you can take some action on a few of these ideas, and of course, if you would like to get a copy of the book, as I mentioned before, HarperCollins, about 150 pages, very well written and thoughtful, as well as giving you some very concrete examples, not only in this country, but in other countries, of where religious freedom is eroding and why it is doing that particular case. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about what is to be done or how to end the witch hunt. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Love to get your thoughts about religious liberty. We're going to certainly let Mary Eberstadt go in just a few minutes, but in the next hour, we've got about a half an hour before we talk with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. He'll be joining us later in that second hour. You might remember he was one of the people considered as a vice presidential running mate with Donald Trump, but we're going to be talking about how to address the issue of Islam and some of those issues. But we're going to have some time, so I'd love to get some thoughts about this issue of religious liberty, how you've faced it, and if you have any questions that you would have for Mary Eberstadt, we'll put you on this hour. Otherwise, we'd love to hear from you in that second hour. 1-800-351-1212. If you just joined us, we're talking with Mary Eberstadt about her book, It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. The last chapter is What is to be Done or How to End a Witch Hunt. And you begin by telling the story of David and Jason Benham. They've been in the studio with me. I've known their dad for decades. And here they were going to be a reality TV show on the Home and Garden television. But once Right Wing Watch and some others began to pressure them, they were forced to step down, and not because they had done anything on the TV program or in their experience of selling thousands of homes had ever discriminated against anybody, but simply because they had a belief that they expressed on a radio program by a host that I know just a few miles from where we're broadcasting today. And that was enough for them to lose their reality show. It is an illustration of, indeed, how intense this witch hunt has become, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The Benham case is important for so many reasons, Kerby. And one of them, and one takeaway that I would like people to have is this. Their show was going to help people. That's what gets overlooked in this. Their television show was going to help people buy homes. And similarly, there are all kinds of Christian efforts at helping people that are being impeded and fought against by secularism today. For example, crisis pregnancy centers are under siege by lawsuits just because they want to help women have babies. Now, who would want to get in the way of that? Well, the answer is runaway activists on the secularist side. They also attack refugee resettlement efforts, again, via lawsuits, and other Christian charities. Adoption agencies have been closed for not towing the secularist line. My point in going through those examples is to say, who would get in the way of helping poor people and destitute people? It fails the 8-year-old test, if you will. I mean, an 8-year-old would say, that's mean, right? It's mean to get in the way of people trying to help people. But secularist progressivism does it all the time. And the bottom line is, that's not where the moral high ground is. They have succeeded by making people think that secularist progressivism owns the moral high ground. They're the nice guys. The Christians are the mean ones. Reality is 180 degrees reversed. And I think the next time you're challenged in the public square by a secularist or your neighbor or your boss, this is the kind of moral ammunition to bring to that discussion and to say, look, Christians want the right to help poor people. Their creed demands that they do this. And we think it's wrong of radical secularism to get in the middle of that mix. What do you think? That's where I think the hope is. It's in returning to some kind of moral high ground that has to be acknowledged in this discussion and isn't being acknowledged now.
Very well said.
So I am hopeful about the future, and hopeful that the ammunition in this book is just that. It is intended as rhetorical and moral ammunition to help get us back to a more grown-up and civil understanding of how to coexist with each other.
I love that 8-year-old test, too. And again, we're talking about a secularist, progressive quasi-theology, and we're talking about holding them to the same standards and banning some of these epithets. But let me take at least one more phone call in this hour before Mary has to leave us. We'll head up to Michigan this time, WLJN. John, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Mary Eberstadt.
Thank you, Kerby and Mary, for being on and helping us to understand some of these things. I just wanted to offer that an approach I have taken online in many debates with what I use online I call the sexual perversions movement, is that there's an emphasis in the leftist culture now, which is advocating against all things that had to do with slavery. And I have found it effective in my debates online to help people understand that the new slavery is the sexual perversions that people are involved in. It addresses in a compassionate way, or it lends to a compassionate address of the issue of the sexual perversions, because they are, in fact, a terrible, terrible enslavement, a captivity of the people who get involved in them. And
you're talking about like addictions and things like that, right?
Exactly right. And when I put it in terms of slavery for those people, then I'm able to address the hypocrisy in the leftist culture that wants to do away with all kinds of slavery and set everybody free, in the politically correct sense. So that's what I had to offer as an approach.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Mary, any quick comments on that one? Because, again, there are some ways in which we're all learning from these books and these different experiences to figure out how to kind of challenge and push back a culture that has been going in the wrong direction. And that's part of that secularist, sexual progressive quasi-theology, I guess you could call it, right?
Yeah, and the question is what to do about it. And I very much admire the spirit of the caller in this. I think the slavery model is apt. And in general, what we need to do is remind people that Christianity has an ennobling idea of human beings. It calls human beings to a very high standard, so high that human beings often fall short of it. But we shouldn't let ourselves just get written off as bigots out there in America in virtue of being Christian. And we can and should, I think, remind people that we're called to higher things, because that resonates with human beings, because human beings are called to higher things.
Very good. Well, again, the book is entitled It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies. If you'd like to know more about Mary Eberstadt, you can go. Of course, we have a link to the Hoover Institution, as well as, of course, she's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center there in Washington, D.C., and also an author of many books and articles. And thank you so very much for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you for having me, Kerby.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some more of your phone calls. If you'd like to join the conversation today, we'll have a little bit of an open line before we get to some of the conversation we'll have later in the hour with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Thought you'd like to hear from him, and especially as we want to talk about this war, this global war on Islam, and the whole issue of radical Islam and radical terrorism and what that might mean, and how to fight ISIS, and so many other questions. So are some issues that we are going to certainly address a little bit later in the hour, but I've left some time for your comments or questions. And of course, I'm going to have a few comments. This presidential campaign has given us a lot to talk about, even a speech today by Donald Trump on economic issues and certainly a few other topics that we will put on the table. So I'll do my best to try to cover all of that and give you a chance to join our conversation. And if after our conversation today about religious liberty, you'd like to talk about that, I would certainly welcome those phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. And before we go to a break, let me just mention again that Point of View is dependent upon your financial support. Our support usually drops to its lowest level in August. Our best month is December, no surprise there. Our worst month is August, no surprise, I guess, there as well. So if you have never given to Point of View before, can I challenge you to do so? And if you've given before, could you give a special gift? But whatever you can do, visit the website, pointofview.net. Click on that donate button. We'll be back with more right after this.
I had what many would call the Cadillac of insurance plans with my company. It covered everything, and that's what got us started thinking, well, what is everything? Are we indirectly paying for people to use services that we don't believe in or want to be a part of? And MediShare was the perfect answer for that.
I felt such relief switching over to MediShare. I wasn't paying for anything that I didn't believe in. I was actually able to stand up for what I believe in, and I was able to put my money where my faith is.
We're part of this great program, and it really costs us less than insurance.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 855-BIBLE-11. Not available in Montana. MediShare, affordable biblical health care. Call 855-BIBLE-11. That's 855-BIBLE-11.
Point of View Radio needs you in 2016. Join today at pointofview.net. Become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. First hour, spent a little bit of time talking with Mary Eberstadt about her book, It's Dangerous to Believe. Later this hour, we will be talking with Lieutenant General Michael T. Flynn. He is the individual that was at least one of the people on the short list to be a vice presidential nominee with Donald Trump. We're going to be talking about Donald Trump today. He seems to be losing now in the state of Georgia. Also gave a speech today on economics and all sorts of other issues, but we do have some calls left over from the first hour related to religious liberty. So let's head out first to California. KYCC. Don, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, greetings from NorCal.
Hey, great to hear from you.
You too. Hey, I appreciated the lady you had on before. You know, I think part of the equation comes from the secular government schools pushing the idea that we are a pluralistic nation, and then once they established that we were no longer a Judeo-Christian nation in their minds, now it just opened the door wide open for all sorts of beliefs. And so one of my challenges that I'd like some of your ideas on is when you're talking to college students and I'm talking to them about this whole issue, well, it's a pluralistic society. Everybody has a right to believe what they want. Well, the problem comes in is the actual application of that. When a Muslim wants to come into our country and practice Sharia law, if we are a pluralistic nation and that everybody gets to practice their religion the way they want, how can we make laws prohibiting some of the things that these various religions do?
Very good.
Because those two things don't fit. Because if we're a Judeo-Christian nation, then those things fit. We tell the other religions they can come and they can practice their religion within certain guidelines.
Yes.
So, you know what I'm getting at?
I certainly do. Let me give you a couple of points. Point number one on this idea of pluralism. There are a number of Christian writers and even historians that have said this, so this is not original to me. But oftentimes what they say is pluralism is what a nation calls itself when it's in the midst of changing from one orthodoxy to another orthodoxy. In a sense, that's kind of what Mary was talking about. There used to be a kind of a Judeo-Christian foundation for America. Does that mean that everybody was a Christian? No. Does that mean all the founders were Christians? No. But does it mean that the foundation of our laws and everything was Judeo-Christian? Of course it was. I mean, that's almost beyond debate. Well, maybe not in some of those universities near you, but nevertheless, I mean, most people would accept that. But now we've gone and accepted this kind of secular, humanistic, progressive foundation. And so for a while, I noticed this in the 1970s and 80s when some of that was breaking down. You still had professors, and I've spoken, on everywhere from San Jose State to Vanderbilt to Princeton to, Auburn or Texas A&M or whatever. They used to say, well, you've heard my point of view, and I'll give a different point of view. But once the orthodoxy began to be established, then all of a sudden, as we pointed out, you better not be a Christian baker or photographer or florist or innkeeper and have any kind of Christian values, because we will prosecute you for those values and those beliefs. So the first issue is we call ourselves pluralistic, but the reality is there's another kind of dominant orthodoxy. But back to the point that you were asking about. even if we accept that idea of pluralism, we recognize that you can't let people do what is right in their own eyes. The book of Judges, you have to at some point have government establish some rules when there's a threat to life, to liberty, or to property. And so this is why I think we could say, even though you are free to practice your religion, fellow Muslim, at the same time, you are not free to impose Sharia law, because that is not the basis of our Constitution. It's not the basis of our set of laws. You, as an individual, may be free to believe certain things, but you can't practice child sacrifice, for example, as part of your religious freedom. And of course, I think this is why I think we as pro-lifers have a very good, powerful argument, because if I can show you there's life inside the womb, and I think everybody would accept that there is, then that's a compelling place for the government to prevent abortion from taking place. And so that's where we draw the line. When there's a threat to life, liberty, property, those are times when you just can't have moral anarchy. You can't just let everybody do their own thing, because then you end up with something that looks like some days Greece looks like, or what sometimes looks like when you have protests against the World Trade Organization. And so that's, I think, at least a guiding principle on where you begin to draw some of those lines.
Very good. I like that. The moral anarchy comes from the idea of pluralism.
Sure.
It breeds it, because it's just not reality. And the reality is there must be a standard. And in our country, it's the Judeo-Christian ethic. If they want the standard to be this new idea that everything's pluralistic and everybody can do what they want, that just breeds moral anarchy.
Sure.
That's very good.
The other way I can use as an illustration, a visual illustration, sometimes helps college students, is I say, how many of you have ever been in the bumper cars? And they almost always have it at Six Flags or something like that. And I said, okay, you can kind of do your own thing in a bumper car, because there's at least theoretically no threat to life, liberty, or property. Maybe spinal problems. Sometimes I get hit pretty hard. But, they understand that, yeah, we can kind of do our own thing there. But if you get out there on Interstate 5, and you decide then that you're going to do the same thing that you've been doing in the bumper cars, we have to stop you from doing that, because now there is a threat. And so this moral anarchy, it sounds real good. And in your personal behavior, you know what? Behind closed doors, you probably can engage in some activities that, if they don't threaten other people, we as a society may disagree with what you do behind closed doors, but we won't prosecute you for those. But as soon as you take those outside the doors and you take them and affect another individual, then government has to step in. It's the old, you are free to swing your arms widely, but your freedom stops at the end of my nose. And once they start understanding that, they go, oh, yeah, right. If I just let everybody do their own thing, especially if I'm in a dorm, I don't want the guy next to me who I'm sure wants to steal my iPad to be able to do his own thing, because he's going to affect my thing by doing his thing. So I think there's some ways to really argue that case in a way that would be very compelling to a typical college student.
Yeah, I think that's very good. Class is in session, and I didn't have to pay for this, huh? But I do need to support it, and I will.
Well, thank you, Don. Appreciate your phone call. Took a little longer for that answer, but I thought it might be helpful. And it is, I think, striking right now, because Mary Eberstadt was talking about all these different cases that we've had. And the example that I've used more recently is, we were talking with Kelly Shackelford about, now there was a pastor in Iowa concerned about what was in some of these brochures. And so now, and also some pastors are starting to wonder if they would lose their tax-exempt status, or whether or not their church is going to come under some of these regulations. And I finally said, it's interesting, because now some of these pastors are starting to stand up and step forward, and it's reminding me, at least, of the old Martin Niemöller quote, because up until now, a lot of pastors haven't been willing to defend bakers and florists and photographers. But now I guess you could say, first they came for the bakers, then they came for the pastors. And now pastors are recognizing maybe we need to stand up and really begin to address this issue of religious liberty, because even our liberty to preach from the pulpits might be affected. Let's take a break. We'll take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Is crime on the rise in America? You got two different answers to that question at the two political conventions. Donald Trump said violent crime has increased in cities across America. President Obama talked about huge drops in the murder rates in a number of cities. You also get various answers depending on the commentator. Newt Gingrich wrote about the crime rate statistics because comedy show host John Oliver mocked Gingrich for defending Trump's statement that crime is on the rise. I even had a caller to my radio program ask about the crime statistics since we are getting different perspectives. President Obama wanted to talk about successes in his speech, so he chose some of the long-term crime statistics. As I explained on my radio program, the crime rate has been dropping for many years, but it now seems to be increasing in major cities. Donald Trump and Newt Gingrich were talking about recent statistics. They are also correct that the crime rate is currently on the rise. Now, skeptics do point out that only a few years of data do not constitute a long-term trend. That is true, but the trend so far should concern everyone. The latest data from the FBI shows that homicides nationwide have risen 6.2% and rapes have increased 9.6%. One analysis of 56 major U.S. cities found that murders increased 16 to 17% during the period analyzed by the study. Of course, we also have lots of anecdotal information. For example, the number of murders in Chicago has risen substantially. In fact, if the trend continues, the city will have more than 600 murders this year. And there is the report from one police association that also has documented the rise in violent crime in 51 large cities surveyed. Yes, Mr. President, the crime rate has dropped over the years. But Donald Trump was talking about the recent uptick that should concern both Democrats and Republicans. John Oliver might think it's funny to mock Newt Gingrich, but the crime rate is serious stuff. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Betrayal, slavery, revenge, redemption. Ben-Hur, in theaters August 19th from Paramount Pictures, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, an open line for a few more minutes before we get to our interview at the bottom of the hour with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Also has a new book out, The Field of Fight. We're going to talk about fighting this global war on terror. But before we do so, let me just bring you up to date on a couple of stories that you need to know about. Donald Trump, first of all, gave a speech today in front of the prestigious Detroit Economic Club. This is a place where oftentimes, or either here or sometimes in New York or certainly at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where various candidates roll out various initiatives, and this one had to be, of course, the economic issues, because the Economic Club certainly entertains that. It was a 55-minute speech. Probably would have been shorter, but there were a dozen times when protesters in the audience interrupted him. They had to drag these people out. And like I said, if this continues, we certainly are headed to a time in which any kind of civil dialogue just simply evaporates. Would Hillary Clinton stand for this if all of a sudden you get some libertarians or other conservative groups that decide to just disrupt her every time she speaks? And there's almost no hesitation, no shame, no compunction from doing that. But anyway, let's ignore them. They deserve to be ignored. But what did he say in his speech? And I wanted to focus on just three things real quickly. One is to eliminate the carried interest deduction. You might go, what is that? Well, the fact that you don't know what that is illustrates exactly what is wrong with our current tax plans because, as he points out, the carried interest deduction along with other special interest loopholes, as he says, has been so good for Wall Street investors and for people like me, but unfair to the American workers. So if indeed he follows through on this, this is something that actually would benefit Main Street, but maybe not so much benefit Wall Street. And this was one of the arguments, one of the more compelling arguments for Donald Trump. There are a lot of arguments against him. I've heard that before, and we'll hear it again. But one of those is he's not beholden to those Wall Street brokers, as Hillary Clinton is, and as other candidates in the past have been, other than Bernie Sanders. And so it is quite possible for him to say, well, I'm going to do what I think is right, and even though maybe I benefited from this, and many of my friends in Wall Street have benefited from this is not right, and we're going to end this. And this is not without precedent. You think about Richard Nixon, an anti-communist, is the one that opens the door to China. You think of Jimmy Carter, who actually has an agricultural background, changing some of the agricultural policies. And you can go on and on. There are some examples where sometimes people whose vested interest or whose mindset actually you might think prevent them from doing that actually sometimes gave them cover to do this. And so that's kind of interesting. So that's one of those. Another one is the whole idea of tax simplification. Our current tax code, he said, is so burdensome and so complex that we waste 9 billion hours a year in tax code compliance. We've had Dan Pill on this program. We've had other programs with all sorts of other individuals that have talked about just how much waste that is and how unproductive it is. And certainly that is something that he wants to do. And then finally, this gets into another aspect of tax code compliance. He just wants three tax brackets, 12%, 25%, 33%. And so begin to, in some respects, reduce taxation, but at the same time, just make it a whole lot easier for individuals to do. So just a few things today from his speech. We'll probably get into some more of it later in the week. But one of the big pieces of news is that Hillary Clinton has been doing very well in the polls so far in some of those so-called swing states. Certainly Colorado, Pennsylvania are two. Of course, they've also talked about Colorado and Virginia, so let me talk about those. But here's the new one. I know we have a lot of listeners in the state of Georgia, and we've talked about before how Donald Trump could shake up the electoral map. There was a possibility that he could win Connecticut. Well, Hillary Clinton could shake up the map because one of the states which was always assumed to be in the column for Donald Trump is the state of Georgia. The assumption is that those 16 electoral votes out of the state of Georgia would automatically go to Donald Trump, just because he's a Republican, if nothing else. And the assumption is that he would start with 206 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. And the assumption is Hillary Clinton would start with 217. Sometimes people concede a few others and give her 224, whatever it might be, depending on which counts you use. And so in some respects, she always has had an advantage. But one thing that you've always assumed is that, as I said before, those 16 electoral votes would go for Donald Trump. Well, you had two things. First of all, you had one elector in the Republican side say he was not going to vote for Donald Trump. We'll leave that to the side because that kind of got resolved. But the other is right now, if the election were held today, and if you assume this poll is accurate, Hillary Clinton leads Donald Trump 44% to 37% in what? The state of Georgia. Now, again, you have to recognize that a lot of that has to do with the African American vote. 84% of African Americans polled in Georgia said that they would vote for Hillary Clinton. Only 6% said that they would vote for Donald Trump. So she has a very significant lead, as Democrats traditionally do nationwide, with the black vote. When you go to the white vote, just the opposite. He bests her 52% to 25%. And so when you start looking at this, you recognize that what does that mean for a Trump campaign? Well, this could be an outlier, but if not, it illustrates that if Donald Trump all of a sudden has to defend the states that we assumed, and he assumed that he would win, oh, that changes everything. And, of course, likewise, if he starts beginning to show any kind of progress, say, in a blue state, then Hillary Clinton has to spend money in a state where it wasn't all that important in the past. But if nothing else, it brings us back to this polling. And as I have in a commentary coming out next week, a lot of you tend to wonder if these polls are accurate. And from a statistical point of view, as I pointed out the other day, they're certainly accurate. A typical 3-day poll of 1,000 people, if proportioned among the 3,000 counties in America, and if you have it somewhat mirroring race, age, geography, those kinds of things, then 19 out of 20 times they will be within 3 percentage points. In other words, that's why you always have that 3% margin of error. And it's really hard to believe that, but if you've ever taken a class in statistics, believe me, I've taken quite a few, you can say that just polling 1,000 American adults will give you a pretty statistically accurate look. So statistically it makes sense, but that's not the problem. The problem is, number one, are they actually polling the right people? In the last election, just a little over half of Americans, 57%, actually voted in the election. So if you're surveying all of Americans, that means nothing, because you really have to get down to the people who are actually going to go to the polls in November, and that's sometimes difficult to determine. But then you also have a second issue, and that is, are the people that you are interviewing giving you an honest answer? And I've talked about this idea of a social desirability bias. In the past, for example, we found a lot of these state marriage protection amendments passed with a much higher percentage than was predicted in the polls, because they felt like they should not necessarily say, I support marriage between a man and a woman, because that might look like it was anti-gay. So I just might say I'm undecided when I know how I'm going to vote. The most extreme example, of course, is what's called the Bradley effect. The Los Angeles mayor, Tom Bradley, African-American, back in 1982, lost, even though he was leading in the polls. And that's due to the fact that some of the pollsters, when they would ask the questions, the people would say, well, I don't know if I should say I'm not going to vote for a black candidate. So they'd say they were undecided or whatever. And this time that could be significant, because number one, there might be individuals who feel that they should say, well, I'm going to vote for the first woman president, Hillary Clinton. Or they might say, well, I'm undecided because I feel like it's sort of unpopular to say I'm voting for Donald Trump. So the point I'm making is these polls are only snapshots. But the biggest issue is, are everybody that are saying they're voting for Hillary Clinton really going to vote for her? And are there some that said that they're undecided, really going to vote for Donald Trump, but they really just don't want to tell a pollster? And if indeed there's even a few percentage points of which that is true, then that means these polls aren't worth a whole lot, which is why we don't talk a lot about polls. But today, the big news is Hillary Clinton, if indeed the election was held today, and if this poll is true, wins Georgia. When did that happen? You've got to go back maybe to Jimmy Carter and a few places like that to say that Georgia, certainly right now, things are a little different than what we might have predicted. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. But as we've mentioned before, we certainly do depend upon your financial support. And as we go to a break, you can find some of the articles we've posted here today, including information about this book. And all you need to do is click on that button that says donate, and that's a way in which you can support this ministry. During the month of August, we always have a financial need. It's probably our worst month. December's obviously our best month. And so if you can help us out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Let's take a break. We'll talk with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn right after this.
Did you know there's an approved healthcare choice just for Christians that's founded on the timeless principles in God's Word? It's not insurance. It's Medishare. Over 189,000 believers across America who love God and share each other's healthcare bills. It's about half the cost of health insurance, and you never pay for medical practices that go against your Christian beliefs. Best of all, the healthcare law includes a special provision for Medishare members, so you don't have to buy insurance or face penalties. Medishare is affordable health care without compromise.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 855-BIBLE-11. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical health care. Call 855-BIBLE-11. That's 855-BIBLE-11.
Cast your vote today for Point of View Radio. Please become a monthly partner at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to this program any length of time, you know that we've oftentimes quoted from Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. We're going to have a chance to actually hear from him today, an individual that served 33 years as a highly decorated Army officer, individual that retired as a Lieutenant General, served as the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Commander of the Joint Functional Component Command for Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, also the Chair of the Military Intelligence Board. This new book book out, 180 pages, written by him, St. Martin's Press, and it really helps us understand the type of war that is being waged right now, and also helps us to formulate a truly winning strategy. General Flynn, it's a delight to have you on the program with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience.
Just before we get into the meat of the book, the first chapter talks just a little bit about, and I thought it would be good for our audience to know, the making of an intel officer, because your own background really establishes your credibility to write on this particular issue.
Yeah, it's a great thing. You know, growing up in a large family, I'm one of 9 children in an Irish Catholic family from a little tiny town, Middletown, Rhode Island, in the smallest state in the Union. They the folks up in Rhode Island are very independent-minded, which clearly I'm one. I grew up, in a sort of a tough household. Great parents. My parents, my father taught us to treat others like you like to be treated, and my mother taught us to be lifelong learners, and I took those to heart. I was a troublemaker as a kid, in many ways, in big ways actually. And then I decided, when I smartened up and got on the right track, really with the help of people who came into my life. My parents were the biggest role models, and then others that came into my life as I was moving through high school and then into college. Finally, before I thought I was going to fail out, I ended up getting an ROTC, a Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship that probably was one of those singular things that really changed my life at that time and got me to really batten down and focus on finishing college and going in the military, in this case the Army. Never thinking that I would ever rise to the rank that I achieved, and as a sort of a rebel, as a child and as a young person, and as someone who always sort of went against the grain of things, I think that's really those sort of formative years really is why I sort of was attracted to the intelligence world, the world of the intelligence community, and then also the world of thinking about who our enemies were, fighting our enemies, on the battlefield in many cases as a young officer, and then certainly over the last 10 to 15 years of my career when we were facing this rise of radical Islamism, which is really what the book is about.
Sure.
So, a lot there in those sort of first 50 pages or so about kind of who I was as a kid, and even in my earlier days, my formative years as a military officer, some of the things I got involved in. But I'm one of those sort of square peg in a round hole, or whatever you want to call it, and always was a bit of a maverick as a kid, and was that way even in the military. So, and people can judge me based on what they read and based on what they see and hear of me these days.
Well, and you're certainly getting a lot of visibility. Of course, spoke at the Republican Convention. We've talked about you quite a number of times, and just a great honor to have you with us. Let's get into this. You have a chapter on war fighting and talk about the Iraq War, really in some respects as a template for Afghanistan and Syria. But we have to, General Flynn, recognize that ISIS and the Taliban and Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, they're growing. So we need to recognize that this is a war, even if sometimes some of our leaders don't treat it like it's a world war. But you disagree with them, don't you?
Yeah, I do. And a couple of things. I mean, the reason why that the book was written and we wrote it was because our current administration, our current president, doesn't allow those in government to call the enemy what we know it is, which is radical Islamism.
Yes.
And that's vicious. I mean, it's vicious. It's barbaric. But it also uses, modernity and high tech and communications like a modern military force uses. And the other reason why the book was written was because a lot of books on this particular subject talk about how bad this enemy is, and nobody really talks about actually winning. So there's a whole chapter on, there's a chapter titled "How to Win."
Right.
And then we walk through sort of the strategic steps of a campaign plan that I firmly believe if we followed those, we would actually be on a path to win. The other thing, though, is that how we need to look at this enemy, and this is not, I'm not a military guy telling you that there's a military solution or only a military solution, and we need thousands more U.S. boots on the ground. I'm not going to sit here on your show and tell you that today, because I don't think that's part of the there's a component, but that's not the bigger problem or the bigger solution. This is really recognizing that we have an ideology that is anti-West and clearly anti-U.S., anti-United States. And that ideology is radical Islamism, and it is a political ideology that hides behind this cloak of this religion. And it makes it difficult for those in our country because we're, freedom of religion. And so we have an administration that does not want to clearly define it. And until you clearly define an enemy, a competitor in business, or any kind of threat that you have, until you're willing to clearly define it, you cannot come up with a strategy to defeat it. And what we're seeing is that unfold in spades in front of our eyes. So for your listeners who pay attention, and I imagine most of them are, we saw the President of the United States back over in the Pentagon the other day, talking to the American public about our strategy, that we are fighting these guys, and that's such a narrow component of our strategy. So why go to the Pentagon and talk about an overarching strategy to defeat radical Islamism and the ideology? Why not talk about it from the Oval Office? Why not take it on as a bigger problem? The military component is a small part of it.
And I might just point out that you are just one of maybe a few people that I've ever interviewed that talk about that middle part. And you obviously talk about destroying jihadist armies and things like that, but you have a whole section there on to discredit their ideology and how we should wage that ideological war against radical Islam. Because when we're fighting those troops on the battlefield, or we're fighting terrorists, in some respects, that's downstream from that radical ideology. And we need to counter it. In some respects, this may be a bad analogy, but counter it the way we countered Soviet ideas and communist ideas with radio programs, Radio Free Europe, and things of that nature. And you're one of the only other people, maybe there's two or three, that I found that recognize how important that aspect is in actually winning this war against Islam, radical Islam.
Yeah, I think it's a great analogy. Actually, it's very appropriate. And we have faced other isms in the past. Nazism, imperialism, fascism, communism, and the way that we faced them was to recognize clearly what they were, which was a way of life that is opposed to our way of life and is actually declared, in this case, the Islamic State and this very sick disease, radical Islamism. They have declared war on the United States and on the West. And so what we have to do is we have to recognize it for what it is. And then when we say, and because I do believe that we should declare war against this enemy, we need to bring together a what I describe in the book as a 21st century alliance that brings together different countries, and we focus on discrediting the ideology that we are facing. And to discredit this ideology, it needs essentially a level of intellectual courage that our current leader, and that's President Obama, is not displaying against this particular enemy. And even though he's been advised, even though he's been briefed on what the intelligence community believes we are facing, he in a way has really refused to call it what it is. And what that's done is it's done a disservice to our nation's ability to, one, understand what it is that we're facing, two, understand how big of a problem this is, and three, to be able to actually craft a winning strategy to truly defeat it. When the president stands up there and says, we're going to destroy these guys, okay, well, we can't even, he can't even say radical Islam.
Words,
that's important, because it's like you just described. It's like saying, or it's like not being able to say communism is the problem, or Nazism is the problem. I mean, that's the problem with what we're facing.
We'll take a break and come back and talk for just a few more minutes with Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. To have a mandatory break, we'll come back and talk more about his book, The Field of Fight, right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us Lieutenant General Michael T. Flynn. And again, you might want to go to his website, michaeltflynn.com. He is the CEO of the Flynn Intel Group, and you can find out more about that, about the book, and some of those great resources. Again, about 180 pages. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've provided a link in case you'd like to order it immediately and to begin reading it. And Lieutenant General Flynn, let's, if we can, talk about this, because you want to talk about destroying the jihadist armies. You want to talk about discrediting their ideology. You also talked just a minute ago about creating a new 21st century global alliance and also try to bring direct and strong challenge to those regimes. Bringing together that alliance is going to require a lot more leadership from the Oval Office than we've had so far, isn't it?
Yeah, one of the things that one of the phrases that I like to use is we become the best enemies because we continue to telegraph everything we're going to do.
Wow.
And on the other side, we've become the worst friends because we've lost the respect of many countries around the world because of some of the things, some of the positions we've taken, or frankly, we just broken relationships. So in this 21st century alliance, this is where American leadership and American values, American principles count. And I really do take on this idea that the Muslim world must stand up and be counted. So the princes, the kings, the presidents, the prime ministers, they have to, in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Morocco and some of these places in that region, they have to be part of this. But in order for them to be part of it, they know, they want, because I know this from the conversations and the research that we did, they want U.S. leadership. It doesn't mean that we have to bring our military forward. What we have to do is we have to bring all of the elements of power that we have to bring to bear, and we have to get these nations together so they can take care of this problem internally themselves, because the Arab world knows, and I lay out in the book a great speech given by President al-Sisi, who's the current president of Egypt, one of the oldest Muslim nations on the planet, and he basically challenged Islam in one of the best speeches that I've seen. In fact, in the history of Islam, he challenged the ideology. What he said, should we expect 1.7 billion people to kill the other 7 billion people on the planet? And he says, absolutely not. We need to have a revolution inside of this ideology that we have, this Islamic world that we have, because it's eating us up inside. And so he calls for a revolution. We should have embraced that. There is still time, and I know that there are leaders around the Muslim world that believe the same thing, but they know that they can't do this on their own. They know that they're going to need not just help from the United States, but from the rest of the international community. And in order to start something like that, and this gets back to discrediting this disease inside of Islam, which does exist, and they have admitted it. The leaders have admitted it. In order to do this, what we have to do is we have to first clearly focus on who it is that we're going after, and go after them with our information means, with our economic means. And yes, there is still going to be violence. I'm not going to discount that, because there's evil that exists, and we just have to we have to understand what our role is in the world to be able to do this. Otherwise, folks, we're going to continue to be facing, these kinds of attacks that we've seen in not only 9/11 but Orlando and San Bernardino and elsewhere, and we just can't have that. We cannot stand we can't allow our president nor our Secretary of State, both of whom have said, well, we just have to put up with this for the rest of time because there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, that's irresponsible, and the American public deserves better.
The strong words that President al-Sisi said to the Muslim world, I thought also you talk about the words from Amir Tahiri, who is an Iranian-born author, and he had some strong words for us, because he says, no major power in recent history has gone out of its way to help, respect, please, and even appease Islam, yet we're still vilified. And oftentimes when we even try to speak honest words, we always hear the response that that's Islamophobia. So not only does the Muslim world need to reform themselves, we need to be a little more courageous, if I take the words of Amir Tahiri to heart.
Exactly. And I mean, these are individuals inside of this ideology who these are bright people who care about the future of the world and do not want to have Islam, in behaving the way it's behaving, knowing that there is moderate Muslims in the world, lots of them, and these are individuals who recognize this. One is a scholar, one is a president, and there are others who are with them. But until our own president recognizes it and understands it, we act like I say in the book. It acts like we sort of treat the rest of the Muslim world like they're a bunch of idiots who don't understand or recognize that, hey, they got a problem, and we just can't live like that. We cannot have this kind of behavior on the global stage and think that, well, we're just going to have to live with it. That's unacceptable.
Well, again, the book is entitled The Field of Fight, How We Can Win the Global War Against Radical Islam and Its Allies. We have a link to your website. And again, if people want to know more about the Flynn Intel Group or about you, we have that all available at our website, pointofview.net. And I know you have another interview coming up, but any final words for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, let's not fear, for your listeners, let's not fear what our country was built upon, which is the foundation of Judeo-Christian principles and values, and let's stand up for who we believe we are, and that's Americans. I mean, we're resilient, we're tough, and what we want is we want honesty from our leadership in this country, And frankly, that's why I'm talking to you today, because I don't believe we're getting the honesty that we need. Hey, we can take it. We're big boys and girls out here in this country, and the biggest problems that we've got is really Washington D.C. and Hollywood. Everybody in between, feels underappreciated, and I don't want the American public to be underappreciated. We can do whatever we're asked to do if our leaders are honest with us. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for talking about this great message in this book.
Great book. And again, about 180 pages, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. And again, the book, The Field of Fight. We have links to the book and to his website. And General, thank you for joining us. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you again so much. It's an honor.
I'll let you get on to your next interview, and we're just about out of time. I apologize for those of you that might have wanted to ask questions. We'll provide that tomorrow. Since he was near the end of the program, that's just sort of what we had to do. But just a privilege to hear from him. A very, very well-written book from an individual that certainly knows a lot about this. I wanted to have him talk a little bit about his credibility. This is the man that served as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He spoke at the Republican convention. Some people even thought he might have ended up being the vice presidential nominee. He was not, but I think he might certainly have the ear of that individual that is running for the presidency and also other members of Congress. But again, 4 major points. First of all, to destroy the jihadist armies. Some of that, of course, is happening right now. But more importantly, to discredit their ideology, something we've talked about before on this program, but very few others have ever raised that. And so I think he's done a very good job in the book of talking about that. Number 3, to create a new 21st century global alliance. And then number 4, to bring a direct and strong challenge to those regimes who support jihadists. Some of that's diplomatic, some of it's militarily. Fair amount of it is cultural, and that's why it's important to understand the nature of the threat. Well, that's all we have for today, and I hope that you appreciated the conversations we've had. And just before we say goodbye, let me again remind you that Point of View is supported by listeners like you, and this is so we can bring this kind of information to you every single day. So please take the time, just if you got a moment, to go to the website, pointofview.net. Click on that donate button. Every gift is important, so please let me hear from you today. Want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
I had what many would call the Cadillac of insurance plans with my company. It covered everything, and that's what got us started thinking, well, what is everything? Are we indirectly paying for people to use services that we don't believe in or want to be a part of? And Medi-Share was the perfect answer for that.
I felt such relief switching over to Medi-Share. I wasn't paying for anything that I didn't believe in. I was actually able to stand up for what I believe in, and I was able to put my money where my faith is.
We're part of this great program, and it really costs us less than insurance.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 855-BIBLE-11. Not available in Montana. Medi-Share, affordable biblical health care. Call 855-BIBLE-11. That's 855-BIBLE-11.
Point of View Radio needs you in 2016. Join today at pointofview.net. Become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.